Hey everyone, welcome to AP World Live Review. This is our last one. We're about to get through the content. This is so exciting. So my name's Emily. This is Anti-Social Studies. We've been doing these AP World Wednesdays for the last few months. And tonight we're going to be reviewing Unit 7 through 9, hey or basically welcome to AP the 20th century. Gotta mute myself. Okay, so welcome in. Everyone say hi in the chat. Welcome back to those of you who've been with me this whole time. If you are new, don't worry, you can go find all the old recordings on this YouTube channel. Hey, thank you for Teacher Appreciation Week. I feel very appreciated. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. If you'll go ahead and like this video, that'd be great. I don't know how algorithms work, but I think that's how they work. And before we get started, I just wanted to give you all a heads up that I'm going to be doing more live reviews this weekend with Heimler. So you should be subscribed to Heimler's History if you're not already. What have you been doing with your life? And the 3 nights before the first test, so May 7th, 8th, and 9th, we are going to be going live. Me, Heimler, and Mr. Freeman of Freemanpedia are going to be going live together, all 3 of us, on Heimler's History channel. And we are going to go through all the content like as quickly as humanly possible. So basically every night at 8 Eastern, May 7th, 8th, and 9th. That's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday before the first test on Monday. Go check them out. I will be there Friday night and Sunday night, not Saturday because I'm going to prom. It's too important. So anyway, hey everyone, welcome. Welcome, Anna. All right, let's start talking about 1900 to the present. So this is really the first era where chronology really matters, and I'm going to argue some dates matter. Because if you really notice, like the last 3 eras we've been talking about are broad. We do talk about some events, but it's not as important to like understand the exact chronology of events. You obviously want to know like the Mongols come later in the first unit because, you know, they conquer everybody, or you'd want to know that the Enlightenment comes first before the revolutions. But in the 20th century, like the difference of a few years is a big deal. And so I'm really normally not big on dates and memorizing dates. I will say there are some sort of marker events that I'll just point out for you that it's just important you understand. You're never going to be asked the year, like in what year did this thing happen? But it is important, especially if you get documents, which you will from this era, right? Because if you get a document and it's talking about Germany in 1938 versus Germany in 1948, those are 2 very different Germanys, right? And so just keep that in mind that I'll be trying to give you some basic like marker event years that I think would be helpful to know. All right. So, we're going to just sort of go chronologically. And I'm really glad to see all these people here, and it's so nice to hear that y'all like my reviews. They've been helpful. I don't think I've done any SAQ practice lives. I will do my best to try to get one up this weekend. If not, definitely before the May 20th test, because the SAQ is a big part of that one. So we're going to go kind of chronologically, but I just want to tell you right now, the only thing the College Board cares about when it comes to the wars are the causes and the effects. They are not going to ask you about like fighting tactics. They're not going to ask you about trench warfare, except maybe to explain like how that affected the peace, right? That like France got really brutalized and fighting on that trench warfare was really terrible. So when they get a chance, they're going to really want to punish Germany. But like, you do not need to worry about battles. You don't need to worry about military strategy, anything like that. You just want to think about what caused these wars and what were the effects of them. And part of that is really easy because the impact and the outcome of World War I basically directly causes World War II. So that's sort of, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone, as it were. So in general, when you're thinking about the causes of World War I, I've been using the acronym MAIN. I'm really excited because TikTok has educated me that I've been missing out on a really prime opportunity here. Y'all check this out. Okay, so there's MAIN. These are the long-term causes, right? Which is like rising militarism, thanks partly to industrialization. You have an alliance system that's very complex and ties countries together. You have, to me, sort of like the, it can be industrialization / imperialism. That's creating competition, and industrialization is providing like the desire for more colonies, right? So think about it. If you're Germany and you're like, hey, if I go to war against Britain and I win, I could get the British Empire. Like that's pretty big incentive to go to war. And then nationalism. But then I realized like, you know what we could be doing is we could be calling it like Main AF, and also then do assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And we could say like the causes of World War I were Main AF. And I'm pretty excited about that. I'm pretty excited about that discovery. So with that, then you have the long-term and then the short-term cause, right? So I will say right now, the long-term causes are infinitely more important. Like, very few people actually cared about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand besides Austria and Serbia. And so really, more likely, you want to talk about the long-term causes. And with that, like, again, all of this is mostly just sort of context for what's going to happen later. In my view, World War I sets up the 20th century. Some historians say that kind of the 20th century really starts in 1914 as opposed to 1900. And so again, you just want to be thinking about all the reasons why this would incentivize these states to go to war. They do not really care about the Austrian monarchy. They don't really care about Serbia or Serbian independence, but they do care about the fact that, one, they have these incredibly powerful militaries now, especially Germany and especially England, and they sort of want to show them off. And also they have this feeling of invincibility where they're like, hey, we have the most powerful military in the world, partly because of nationalism, right? And so that makes them more eager to go to a war without really thinking it through. The other thing with industrialization and militarism, of course, is that the fighting's just gonna be way more intense. And so the other thing you have to understand is you have to contextualize this war. You have to realize that, like, before this war, for the most part, we're still talking about old school, like, march, point, and shoot, right? So think the Civil War, right? I mean, the Civil War was like the most modern war, that and the Crimean War, that we'd ever seen. And think about how the Civil War was fought. And so the reason why that's important is that the generals and the people making decisions and the people in charge, when they're thinking about war, they're thinking about 19th century war. And so they're like, well, with our weapons and with what we have now, like, of course we would win any of those wars really quickly. And so there's all these super awkward documents now that haven't aged well where they're like, oh, it'll be fine, we'll be home by Christmas. But of course, the problem is that if you have the old strategy of like, we're gonna meet on an open battlefield and march and shoot, but both sides or one side has machine guns or poison gas, well, all of a sudden that becomes hell, like hell on earth. Now, I'll be totally honest, you should just go watch the movie 1917 if you want to like see more about the warfare. But like I said, they're not really going to ask you about that. Or Wonder Woman, that scene where she like goes across no man's land, right? But for the most part, they just want you to understand the long-term causes. The way that I think of this is that this is the culmination of the rise of Europe, right? If we go all the way back to the first era and we talk about like 1200 to 1450 and we say, wow, Europe was like medieval. They were the exception. They were kind of way behind, way backwards. But slowly those innovations and ideas are coming along the Silk Road and coming from the Middle East thanks to the Crusades. Okay, 1450 hits and they get lucky and they discover the Americas and they're trying to like get on top. They're trying to compete with Asia. They're starting to rise from 1450 to 1750. Then with industrialization and the Enlightenment, they reach their peak in this last era, 1750 to 1900, right? And so they reach their peak, they're at their height, they're scrambling for Africa, they literally control almost the entire world. And this era, starting with World War I and going through World War II, is their collapse, right? And so I don't like viewing history this way because it's totally Eurocentric, but I do think it's probably the easiest narrative to follow as far as keeping track of stuff for your test. That if we think of it as the rise and then collapse of Europe, this is the beginning of the collapse. Then I'm going to argue we're kind of back now, starting in Unit 9, we're kind of back to a 1200, 1300 again. We're a bunch of different states that are connected by trade routes like eBay and Amazon, and like we're going to see the rise of new empires. It's going to get crazy. Okay. So with that, the main thing that you really want to think about more is like, not only what problems did World War I not solve, but also like what problems did World War I create? Like the irony of Woodrow Wilson being like, let's make this the war to end all wars. Like the irony of that is insane. Because first, World War I doesn't actually really solve. I mean, think about those long-term causes. Like, you still have militarism. Now we've just destroyed the German military through the Treaty of Versailles and said, you can never have one again, which is like, and what we've done is we've taken an extremely nationalistic state that their pride was in their military, and we've now stripped their military from them. Their nationalism isn't gone. Their desire for like imperial power isn't gone. Some of their alliances aren't gone. So it's like that hasn't solved anything. That's actually just kind of made things worse. Cue Hitler, right? So think about it, like all those main causes aren't gone. And then we create more problems by the way that we kind of treat the losers and also the way that we treat the people who fought with the European states who won. So if we're thinking about how we treat the losers, I mean, we just tear them apart, right? I mean, Germany most famously in the Treaty of Versailles, right? They have to pay an insane amount in reparations. Literally, someone can look up the exact year, but like Germany just kind of out of spite just finished paying their World War I reparations. I think it was like in 2011. It was within the last 15 years, just out of spite. Like everyone was like, you're fine, Germany, you don't have to pay them back. They're like, no, if you made us do this, we're going to pay you back. And their military gets totally dismantled. A lot of their industrial areas get taken as sort of reparations for France. And so we've kind of broken them apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire gets broken apart, which is just incentivizing. Now there's all this land in Eastern Europe that a new communist Russia is like, ooh, Soviet sphere of influence, right? And then, I mean, the Middle East gets broken up in this mandate system, right? The Ottoman Empire, man, this decision is really coming back to haunt all of us, right? What they do with basically the remaining part of the Ottoman Empire is they scramble it up like they did in Africa, right? They just start drawing things on a map and they're like, oh, you're going to be a thing called Iraq and you're going to be a thing called Syria and okay, fine, y'all can be Turkey and we'll kind of let Italy administer you. Like they just divide it up without really much consideration for what they were doing. So like if you're a Kurd, like an ethnic Kurd, you end up and you're like, wait, I'm now in like 4 different boundaries. Shia, Sunni get all mixed up. It's bad, right? And so like not only does World War I not really solve any of the long-term problems that caused the war, but it also creates the tensions that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the century until today, right? I mean, so it also creates these problematic borders in some parts of the world that we're still trying to solve. Then, of course, even if you were on the winning side, but you're not one of the main powers, you're also pissed, right? So something I want to point out is like, that when we talk about it being a world war, right? I'm just going to go to this map because it shows me the whole world. Actually, is this one? No. So when we say it's a world war, it's because it really is. It's like all the different colonies these places fought. And so I want you to think about like, you know, at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I, like there were representatives from African colonies. Ho Chi Minh, a young Ho Chi Minh comes from Vietnam. He's not a communist yet. He's like, hey, I feel like colonized people fought for you. Like we should maybe be included in the conversation. And they're all totally shut out. Japan tries to go because they sort of sided with the Allies a little bit. They didn't like send a lot of troops. And there's a ton of like racism of being like, Japan, you think you're cute. You've had your Meiji Restoration. You're industrial, but you're not one of us. Which is only going to push Japan to be like, fine, I guess I'll have to build my own empire over here. It's like everything that could have gone wrong at that peace conference they handled almost every interaction wrong, right? So even like people in India who are like, we just fought and died for you, what are you going to do for us? You're Ho Chi Minh, you're like, hey, don't forget about colonized people, maybe they can get more self-determination. And they're like, ignore those completely. And then if you're one of the smaller powers, like you're Italy or you're Japan, it's made very clear to you that you're not one of the cool kids. It's very clear to you that it's England, France, and the United States, and you are ignored. And so again, like it's no coincidence that like 2 of these states that were on the Allied side in World War I are going to rise and develop these sort of fascist or militaristic governments that end up fighting against those allies in World War II. We had a chance to like bring in a lot more parts of the world. Okay, rant over. Oh my gosh, Treaty of Versailles is so awful. So with that then, we want to think about how that sort of leads into the causes of World War II. And so, you know, one of the things that gets talked about in Unit 7 is sort of the like interwar years. And really the biggest thing you would want to know from that is there are like colonial tensions, right? There are tensions this is, for a good example of that would be, I think it's 1930, but I could be a year or 2 off, is Gandhi's Salt March. So that's an example of like, hey, in this interwar period between World War I and World War II, you're starting to see a much more organized push for independence movements, right? You start to see a lot more like Pan-African conferences being held, talking about like, what do we want as African colonies? So you have those colonial tensions, and then you also have obviously the Great Depression. and you have states taking more control of the economy, and that's in a lot of different ways. So like in the US, that's FDR's New Deal, which is really like the closest the US gets to like state socialism. It's not state socialism, but there are some things about it, like Social Security, that sort of thing. He actually pushed for universal health care, but that got struck down. So it's like that is an example. On the spectrum, when we're also talking about Stalin and Hitler, that's still pretty tame, but still. You start to have the rise of kind of democratic socialism in parts of Europe, although this is going to become way more prominent after World War II. You have Stalin's 5-year plans where he's trying to like rapidly reorganize and communize the economy. And of course you have the rise of fascist dictatorships, which are actually actively promoting like capitalist competition, right? And that's going to be Mussolini and Hitler. And so again, like there's not a ton of events in between the two world wars that you like have to know, but it's just this overall trend of like states becoming more dominant and more totalitarian. Like again, when I teach APUSH, I talk about FDR and I'm like, there were a lot of people who worried we were having like a totalitarian dictatorship under Democrats, because FDR was like kind of doing whatever he wanted and was trying to like pack the Supreme Court and stuff. So even though it's not nearly as bad as what was happening in other parts of the world, there was still this trend going on, right? Okay. So with that, you know, you have these long-term causes, right? So you have kind of the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles for Germany specifically. You have the Great Depression, which leads to the rise of kind of stronger centralized states, governments, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is when they're fascists or communists or whatever. And so you also have a weak League of Nations because the US never joins. Awkward. Woodrow Wilson was very arrogant and couldn't figure out how to get his own Congress to go along with him. So the League of Nations, which was created after World War I, trying to prevent another world war, just like it is a total failure. But those are the long-term causes. The two real causes that I would know that really happened more in the 1930s is going to be the two A's. It's going to be aggression by Germany and Japan, and it's going to be appeasement by the West. And so what that means, right, is that throughout the 1930s, almost side by side, almost year for year, you have Germany and you have Japan expanding and conquering new places. So literally like within a year of each other, you have Germany elects a president who selects Hitler to be chancellor, and then Hitler slowly uses that democratic position to take complete power. 1 year before Hitler becomes chancellor, Japan invades Manchuria and sets up like a puppet state called Manchukuo in like the state of Manchuria. And from that point on, it's just like a step by step where Germany is slowly expanding because it's claiming it needs quote unquote Lebensraum, living space, which is the euphemism of the century, right? And what they do is they're really smart, right? First, they start taking back territory that is German, but was just kind of controlled by other places after the Treaty of Versailles. So they first take back like the Rhineland, and France and England are like, well, okay, that Treaty of Versailles was pretty harsh. Then they start annexing places that are like also German speaking, and you know, a lot of them actually wanted to be part of the new German Empire. So like Austria, like, you know, had parades for Hitler. That doesn't mean everyone wanted him there. Go watch The Sound of Music. Captain Von Trapp was not for it. But there are a lot of people in Austria who are like, great, we'll benefit from this, right? Sorry, I just skimmed over the chat. Y'all are funny. Okay. And then they start getting into territory where they're like, well, there are these Germanic parts of places like what we now would think of as Czechoslovakia. They speak German. They probably want to be with us, right? We're going to annex some of those places. Now I'm going to pause there. The same thing's happening in Japan, right? First, they're just sort of taking control. You know, in the early 1900s, they'd taken over Korea and Taiwan. They're taking some islands that most places don't really care about. When they invade China, that's a big deal. China is not communist yet. China is our guy. We've negotiated this open door policy right around the turn of the century specifically to be like, no one gets to conquer China. We're all going to divide up China to share amongst ourselves because it's too valuable. And so that's a violation of that, right? And so the US is also kind of pissed because we're like, hey, like we wanted to be the big empire in the Pacific, right? Because keep in mind, Germany actually had a lot of islands that they controlled in the Pacific. So when they lose World War I, those go away. and they get given to different groups, but some of them are up for grabs. So this becomes sort of an island grab between Japan and the United States. So again, both sides are slowly aggressing. And so it is very clear that like we can blame World War II on Hitler and the Japanese government very easily. That makes perfect sense to me, right? A more complex argument, see what I did there, is to say, well, yes, it was their aggression, but also it was the way that the rest of the world appeased them that really made it even worse. So there are these arguments, right? And a lot of this is like hindsight, right? Hindsight is 2020. Like, man, why didn't we go back and stop Hitler in 1931? Well, we're in the middle of a Great Depression. We're a little busy trying to feed for our own people right around the Western world. And also, we didn't really know and we didn't really care, right? I mean, we had just fought this terrible, brutal world war, and we all had sort of vowed, like, we're never doing that again. We're going to stay out of everyone else's business. And so it's ironic, right? Because World War I was a war that like no one had any business getting involved in. But World War II, everyone should have gotten involved in, but they'd like learned their lesson from the First World War. So it's completely flipped, right? And so with that, there's all this appeasement going on. And I will just say the two examples of that I think you should know would be with Germany, it would be 1938, the Munich Conference, which is where very famously British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain meets with Hitler, and they basically establish an agreement. So they establish like a peace treaty where basically Hitler's like, look, I want to take the Sudetenland, which is kind of modern day Czech Republic. And British Prime Minister's like, I don't think that's a great idea, but like, okay, fine, I won't stop you. And then we're going to establish peace. We will not go to war with each other. And as long as you promise that you're done invading places. And Hitler's like, promise, which, you know, was stupid. There's a great Malcolm Gladwell whole podcast called Revisionist History. There's a whole episode that goes into like, why did no one seem to understand Hitler and what he wanted when he was pretty clear about it? So this conference is like the best illustrative example of appeasement. It is so overt. It is like they are sitting at a table with Hitler and he's like, I want to invade this land. And they're like, fine, we won't stop you. Like that's appeasement. And so they really just did not understand what Hitler wanted, right? Because they think we're all operating off of this idea of like global peace and stability. Nope. Hitler doesn't want that. He actually, a war would be great. A war would be great for him to kind of prove that he's like a new strong leader in Germany, right? Okay. So the same thing is happening in Japan, and really the people to blame that are not responding super well are the United States, right? And so what happens is as Japan starts taking more and more colonies, we're like, stop it, Japan, quit it. And what we do to try to get them to stop is we start to restrict the sale of what are called kind of generally strategic materials. So we were one of their primary sources of like oil, steel, things they needed to industrialize. And so we kind of held that over their head and we were like, look, we don't want you're conquering China, you're going in and invading these places you're not supposed to do. So we are going to stop selling you this stuff until you quit it. The problem is that if you stop selling them oil and steel, that just incentivizes them to go get more colonies where they can get it for free. So like, again, we were betting on this idea that Japan wanted peace and stability. And it's like, no, Japan's so pissed. Like Japan, as a member of the League of Nations in the 1920s, proposed a racial equality clause. They proposed a clause where the League of Nations would be like, we respect all races as equal. What they really meant was like, the Japanese are just as good as the Western Europeans. And the Western European countries were like, no, we're not going to sign that because we don't think you're equal to us. Like, I don't know why the United States thought Japan was like just wanting to like be friends and trading buddies with everybody, right? They'd already been burned. And so we restrict the sale of these strategic materials, and Britain and all these other places do the same. So they're like, okay, fine. Well, now I'm just going to conquer even more land so I can just get oil for myself. Oh, in hindsight, right? Yeah. So if I could just like travel back in time. Well, I don't know what I would do. This is more complicated than that, but still. Okay. So those are the main causes of World War II. How much do you need to know about World War II? The only stuff you need to know about like the fighting in World War II is the stuff that is going to directly impact the next era, like the era of the Cold War. So let me just point out maybe 2 or 3 things that I think would be good for you to know. One is that Hitler conquers France like hella fast. Hitler's like at the Eiffel Tower within a few months. The French, as they were fleeing, cut the cables on the elevator to the Eiffel Tower. So if you wanted to go to the top, you'd have to walk, which is very petty and I like it. And so really, for the most part, for most of the war in Europe, it's the Soviet Union fighting Germany. It's the Eastern Front. There is no Western Front. The Western Front's like the English Channel, right? And so I will say this is important because the Russians are just going to lose, I think they lose 20 million people in World War II. It's insane. And they are just growing more and more resentful of the West and being like, why are y'all not getting back on this continent and helping, right? And so you have like England, France, when the US eventually joins, we're like fighting in North Africa. We eventually start fighting through Italy. But the Soviet Union's like, get here. Like, why are you not here? Why are you not invading France? Why did it take till 1944 to have D-Day and to invade France? And so after the war, there is some real resentment from the Russian people who felt like, hey, the US and Britain are just letting us do the fighting and the dying. And I mean, there's some documents from US officials being like, it's kind of a win-win, right? If like the Soviets are the ones mostly dying fighting our enemy, the Germans, like that's fine with us because they're communists. So this is good context for that like Cold War rivalry. It's not just about like high-minded philosophy and capitalism and communism. It's also about like, you were supposed to be our allies and like, where were you, right? So some dates that I would maybe know, I don't know, they can be helpful for this kind of thing is like 1939, World War II starts, it's just in Europe. 1941 is the turning point. That's when Hitler invades Russia, so Russia gets involved, and Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, so the US enters. And then, just again, it's not till 1944 that we have D-Day. So it's not till like 3 years after we've been in the war that we finally get back on the European continent and try to help the Russians. And then, of course, 1945, if nothing else, is a year you like have to know, right? The end of World War II. 1945 is a turning point year. Like every history class I had in college was either like before 1945 or after 1945. That's it. It's a huge year that you have to know. And so again, I think like understanding D-Day for that reason is helpful as context. Obviously in Japan, right, we're doing this campaign of like island hopping, which sounds really fun and it's not. It's like a D-Day every time. And then really by the last year of the war, we get close enough to Japan where we can just firebomb Japan. Like we invent napalm. The US government actually hosts a science competition among chemists and is like, hey, all the smart scientists out there in the United States, who can create the deadliest material that will burn most of Tokyo to the ground? And there's literally like a competition with like college scientists and stuff, like at universities, and Harvard wins out and they invent what's going to be known as napalm. And the whole point, like they build an actual fake Japanese village out in the desert and just test it out and see like which one's going to burn down as many Japanese buildings as possible, right? And so the destruction in Japan is enormous even before we drop 2 atomic bombs. Now, of course, right? The argument for dropping the bombs, there's 2 real reasons why the US dropped the bombs strategically. One is to end the war earlier, and it is clear, most historians say, it probably saved 2 years off the war. More importantly than that, though, is that we didn't want the Soviets to get into Japan, right? So the other thing that matters about like the way World War II is fought is that World War II ends in Europe in the summer. And the fighting in the Pacific is still going on. And the fighting in the Pacific has mostly been us in Australia, that sort of thing, right? And actually British India, right? They're fighting to kind of defend Indochina. So we are basically racing to end the war as quickly as possible because now that the war is over here, a bunch of Soviet soldiers are starting to hop on that Trans-Siberian Railroad and make their way over here to help us. And we're like, thank you so much, Stalin, but we really don't want them there because we want control over this part of the world after the war's over. They make their way down into kind of the northern part of Korea, and when we can't decide what to do, we're like, we'll just divide it in half and figure it out later, right? They're going to start to come in and influence parts of China. Eventually, we're going to be like, let's just divide up Indochina in north and south and figure it out later. That's not going to end well. And we don't want that to happen with Japan. So the more complex argument for why we dropped the bombs is we needed to get that war over before the Soviets could get too involved so that we could control the peace in Asia. Again, literally all of world history is Westerners trying to control and get to Asia. That's it. That's literally all world history is. It's like the West trying to control East Asia. From the Silk Road and Marco Polo to dropping the atomic bombs before the Soviets get there. That's it. Okay, I'm going to scroll through the chat really quickly. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. So, let's see. I see a lot of people worrying about things like the LEQ and the DBQ, that sort of thing. I'll be doing more posts about this over the next few days, but just keep in mind that like on the LEQ, right, the only parts of the test that don't give you some sort of stimulus, like a document to help you out, you have choices then. So on the paper exam for Monday, May 10th, like when you have an LEQ where, yeah, you don't get documents, whatever, you have 3 choices of prompts from 3 different eras. So the likelihood is you will know one well enough to write like a three paragraph essay, which is really all you need, right? Everything else, the DBQ, the SAQs, the multiple choice, you have some document that at least helps you out. So just keep that in mind. And this is why I'm kind of reviewing this the way that I am, where I'm saying like, what's the big idea of what's going on? And then what are like 1 or 2 specific pieces of evidence? Because you actually don't need nearly as much specific evidence as you think, right? Think about it. For the DBQ, you just need 1 piece of additional evidence. For each SAQ, you just need 1. For the LEQ, maybe 2 or 3, right? 1 or 2 for each body paragraph. What matters more is that you can explain how a specific piece of evidence relates to the broader themes. So don't spend the next few days just like frantically doing flashcards. Think instead about like, what are the big ideas of the course? If you're not sure, go back and watch my intro videos, and then just make sure you have enough specifics that you can support it with 1 or 2 examples, right? And so if you're taking the paper exam on Monday, May 10th, it's the old school test. You have 55 multiple choice. You have a section of 3 short answer questions and then a DBQ and LEQ. On the digital exams that are later on, it's the exact same, except instead of an LEQ, you have 2 more SAQs. That's the only difference. Everything else is the same. Okay, so with that, let's jump into what I think is the more confusing and more important unit. I think Unit 8 is way more important than Unit 7. Partly just because Unit 7 is pretty straightforward. It's like World War I, interwar, World War II. Unit 8 should be 2 units. I don't know why they didn't divide it into 2. It should be the Cold War, and then it should be decolonization. So one of the things is that we should think of this era, like 1945, is the collapse of European empires, and with them, the collapse of traditional empires as we've been talking about them for 750 years. So since 1200, we've been talking about how are states gaining and maintaining power. And we've been talking about the rise of like first gunpowder empires, then industrialized empires. And the idea is like control land, control ports directly. By the end of the 1800s, we started to develop this other type of empire, which is like an economic empire, right? So we carved up our spheres of influence in China, but even that's still kind of direct. The United States, though, started to like influence the economies, especially of Latin America. And so what's happening now is like, this is going to sound like an understatement or something, but like Hitler ruined the idea of empires. Like no one after Hitler wanted to be put into a category with him, because his whole thing was like, hey, I'm building an empire based on racial superiority. And the British look around and are like, ooh, that's awkward. That's exactly what we've been doing for the last 200 years. Now, they're not like committing genocide. I mean, they're committing some terrible atrocities, right? So what happens is that everyone has to say like, well, shoot, we can't be put in the same group as Hitler. And so that traditional type of empire that is based on this argument of racial superiority and directly dominating and controlling the land kind of goes out of style, as it were. And so now the 2 superpowers that are left have to figure out other ways to build up their empires. And these are going to be more economic, more cultural and societal empires. So I want to be really clear when we talk about the Cold War. It's cold because US troops never directly fought Russian troops. But otherwise, it's very hot. Like, I, as a world history teacher, really take issue with calling it the Cold War because, like, tell that to, I don't know, anywhere else, like, besides Europe. and the United States. Everywhere else, there is a ton of fighting and a ton of bloodshed that is kind of done on behalf of the Cold War battles. Okay, so this is where I might get in trouble with some like true American patriots. Sorry in advance. So the U.S. is we also sometimes just call it the West. They are fighting for not communism. That is their main goal. We do not want communism to spread. Now, we say things like freedom and democracy. In practice, what we mean is economic, like laissez-faire freedom, right? So like free trade, less government regulation, less government control of the economy, which is a very communist thing. I mean, right? Like that, so that makes sense. And by democracy, we mostly just mean not a communist government. And I say that because, as we should know by now, we support some pretty atrocious governments in the name of anti-communism, right? And so again, at any given time, these are our different reasons. Like there are times when we truly are on the right side of history and we are truly helping end or stop some totalitarian dictatorship from spreading, like in North Korea. But there are other times where we are on the wrong side of history and actually we're overthrowing people that just wanted to like give land back to their peasants that was controlled by oil companies and stuff, right? And like we overthrow them. Okay, so just, right, keep that in mind. It's a world history class, not a US history class. So the Soviet Union is fighting for the opposite. They're fighting to spread communism. So just so that we're clear, the Soviet Union and the USSR are the exact same thing. The USSR is just the acronym. Russia is technically just one country in the Soviet Union, but I will say it's fine if you use them interchangeably. We sort of know when you're talking about the Cold War, if you say Russia, you really kind of mean the Soviet Union. So with that in mind, they are fighting to spread communism worldwide. And really what both of this is like, I'll be totally honest, like when I talk about growing empires throughout all of world history, it's kind of the same thing every time. And it's that like the reasons why people are trying to conquer land are economic, period. I sounded like I was gonna say something else. It's economic. You want control of land, you want control of resources, you want control of markets, trade routes, whatever. But like economics doesn't motivate people to go fight and die. Like people don't go fight and die like for capitalism or for state control of the oil industry. Like that's not why people go fight wars. They fight wars over culture and society, right? And so this is why on both sides, right? The Soviet Union is saying like, we are fighting for freedom. We are fighting for the workers. We're fighting for the people of the world against the US imperialists who want to like be greedy and take your money and those capitalists and blah, blah, blah. And the US is saying the same thing. We're like, no, we're fighting for freedom. We're fighting against tyranny and dictatorship. And we're fighting for democracy and, you know, freedom from those mustachioed dictators like Stalin or whatever. And so really, both sides are just wanting power and influence and economic control. But like, again, we see a ton of propaganda that's being used to kind of convince people to fight. Now, just like the rest of the world, or the rest of Europe. Oh no, where'd my thing go? Sorry, I lost my PowerPoint for a second. There we go. Okay. Just like in World War I, most of the rest of the world didn't care about Austria or Serbia. In the Cold War, the rest of the world didn't care about the US or the Soviet Union. They didn't care, and most of them didn't really care about this big philosophical debate and divide or whatever. But what happens is the Cold War is going on while this other more important trend is happening, which is decolonization. And so think about the rest of the world. Korea is getting independence from Japan. China becomes communist. You have the Middle East kind of finally trying to like decide their own borders. You have Africa becoming decolonized. And you also have Latin America that really hasn't had the chance to like fully define itself without the influence of the United States. So the rest of the world does not really care that much about the US or the Soviet Union or whatever. But the problem is that they are either becoming independent, like in Africa and Asia, or trying to build up their own country in the shadow of what we call this bipolar world. There's two poles. You can either be with the Soviet Union or you can be with the United States, and you can't be in between. We'll talk about the non-aligned movement. They try, but it doesn't work very well. And so the problem is that every new country that pops up out of decolonization immediately has a choice to make that is life or death. Immediately, if you are like, hey, I'm elected Prime Minister of the Congo, this is great, I can't wait to have some time to try to rebuild. Immediately it's like, are you communist or not communist? And you have to decide. And if you decide wrong, you could get assassinated, right? And so the problem is that the Cold War basically is the context for every event that happens in the world between 1945 and 1991. If you're talking about any event that is happening in that time, your context could be the Cold War, because it impacts everything, right? So with that, the reason why decolonization is occurring is because of World War II. So after 1945, two things happen. There's a top-down and a grassroots. So at the top-down, Europe is devastated from the war. Even if you won the war, your economy is completely destroyed. And Hitler kind of made empires look pretty bad. And so they're like, well, if we're going to really claim that we were on the right side of history fighting against Hitler, then we can't really keep all of these colonies that we've been claiming to be racially superior to, right? So there's that, where there is already the willingness, especially by the British, to start letting go of some of its colonies. And then there's also this growing independence movement throughout Africa and Asia who fought in World War II, who, heard all the rhetoric about fighting against tyranny and fighting for freedom and fighting against racism and that sort of thing, and thought, great, I'd like some of that too. So those two forces come together, and we have this mass period of decolonization where states are becoming independent, or they're just kind of losing like the full influence of these other places. Okay. Before we get to those decolonization movements, the important thing is to understand that like the Cold War is fought in a few different ways. So we do have just direct allies, especially NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and we do fight proxy wars. There are times when the US sends troops or the Soviets send troops to fight, right? These are the ones I made kind of in purple. Sometimes our troops are like the Marines or the CIA. Sometimes it's traditional troops like in the Korean War. Sometimes we're not necessarily sending troops, but we're sending advisors, we're sending money, like in the Angolan Civil War. Sometimes we're sending the CIA to help us assassinate leaders. By the way, the Congo, right, in the midst of the Cold War is the inspiration for Wakanda. I did a whole TikTok on it, you should go check it out. The Soviets do the same thing. The Soviets try to invade Afghanistan in the 1980s. It's not going to go well, right? We also obviously are like pushing for influence. The other thing to note though is that like there were a lot of movements. It sort of makes sense that like if you were a Latin American or an African or an Asian state, and now after 1945 is the first time that like European empires are really weakened and you feel like you have some room to figure out what you want to do, it makes sense that you would want to redistribute some land and resources. It makes sense that like if you come to power in Kenya or something like that, or Ethiopia, and you're like, wow, the inequality is crazy here because it was built as a colonial state, not Ethiopia, right? Like Angola, right? It was built as a colonial state where the top, like very few, controlled so much of the wealth because the whole thing was getting the wealth out of the country. It makes sense that if you're a leader, you would say, you know what, we need to redistribute some of this land back to the people. We need to maybe take some of the resources back for ourselves that had been sold off to, foreign companies. The problem is that all of those are like communist buzzwords. So the problem is that right at the time when like India, for example, like a state in Western India just establishes itself as like, yeah, we're a communist state, right? So some of them are that overt, but others are like, no, we just want to redistribute some things. We want to like nationalize our oil, like in Iran, so we're getting the benefit. Or we want to redistribute land in Central America away from these foreign companies like the United Fruit Company and give it to peasants. The problem is that if you're the United States, to us, it's like that's a gateway drug, right? Redistributing land is a gateway drug to full-scale communism. And so we feel that we have to go in at any moment and stop it. And Soviets feel like they have to go in and support it, which just makes those countries worse, right? It just makes all of these debates they're having and problems they're trying to figure out even harder to do. Okay. All right. Decolonization. There's so many, there's dozens. That's the whole point. Almost every country gets independence, like that was a colony in a period of a few decades. What I would suggest is a few different types. I would know one of each of these types in both Africa and Asia. And so what I would do is I would pick, like, okay, there's some that negotiated for their independence peacefully, right? And so I would pick India because you have to know Gandhi. He's one of the few people that's mentioned by name. And then I would pick someone in Africa. I would pick Ghana, and their leader Kwame Nkrumah, who's sort of like the Gandhi of Ghana. Right? So I would pick one of each, and I would just know the basics that, hey, these are two places where they had very elite, enlightened, intelligent, kind of Western educated leaders who came back to their country, Kwame Nkrumah or Gandhi in India, and they helped negotiate with the British to gain their independence peacefully. Great. And then you're like, for example, Ghana, or for example, India, right? I would also know that there are some states that fight their war for independence. And so again, I would pick one in each. Algeria, I think, is a really good one. Vietnam is a good one. What I want you noticing is, like, the British are negotiating way more often. The French are fighting way more often, right? And that's partly because the French had a lot less after World War II. So they're like, we can't lose our colonies too, right? So the Algerians fight a war. Actually, France tries to offer them, like, hey, you could just be part of France. We'll, like, make you sort of equal to us. And it's this nationalist movement. They're like, no, we're Islamic. We have this, like, other history, and they fight a war that they end up winning. Vietnam obviously starts. The Vietnam War really is the Vietnamese war for independence from France. But when France kind of can't keep up the fight, the U.S. steps in, because at that point, Ho Chi Minh had declared that he was a communist. Because, like, no one in the West would listen to him. So why not, right? I would also know at least one or two examples of smaller movements of, like, regional, religious, or ethnic movements that within this chaos are like, hey, what about us? So that could be like Quebec in Canada. That could be the Muslim League in Pakistan being like, wait, we don't want to be lumped into India and now be a minority again. Think about the importance of this partition too, by the way. Think about the history that we've talked about, going all the way back to 1200 and the Delhi Sultanate, right? There's been a Muslim minority ruling India. And so it makes a lot of sense that they'd be really scared about being now part of a fully independent, huge India where they're going to be ruled by majority Hindus, right? From the Delhi Sultanate to the Mughals, like, they have been a minority religion ruling over a majority. So it makes sense to me that they're like, let's make our own place, right? And then lastly, there are redrawn political boundaries. There are places where kind of the UN or the West sort of steps in to redraw. And really, it's Pakistan and it's Israel, right? I mean, the partition, right, is literally taking kind of redrawing on the map. And then it's Israel being sort of like sanctioned and kind of confirmed as a legitimate state by the UN. They try to draw this like two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. It doesn't work. They break out into war pretty much immediately. So again, I don't think you need to know every single decolonization movement. I would know one or two of each of these different types. All right, cool. Okay, we're to Unit 9, which, to be totally honest, is not very important for the test. It's really important to your lives because of, like, your literal life. But I'm going to go through Unit 9 super quickly. But I really want to leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A. And so as you have questions, either content-wise or questions about the test, be thinking about that, and then I will do my best to kind of go through and scroll through the chat and find your questions. Maybe help me out. You could be like, question at the beginning so that I know that's what it is and it's not just y'all chatting with each other. So Unit 9 is really just wrapping all of this up. And my argument is sort of Unit 9 is like going all the way back to Unit 1 and 2 again. It's like, hey, how are states facilitating innovation? And then how is innovation expanding trade and interaction? That's all we talked about with the Silk Road, right? And I'm just going to argue like the US and China are like the new Song dynasty and Abbasid Caliphate. Boom, right? We've just made it full circle. And so obviously we have advancements in communication and transportation, which make things easier. So instead of the Silk Road, we have eBay or Amazon. Instead of, the translation movement, we have the internet. We also have like the radio. Don't forget about the older ones too, right? Radio, TV, airplanes. We have advancements in medicine, partly because of global pandemics like the 1918 flu. We have the birth control pill, which radically changes women's status in society. And we have cultural diffusion and syncretism, which is what we've been talking about this whole time. So instead of Swahili being a mix of different languages, we have Bollywood, right? Or we have McDonald's, where this is in Russia, but like McDonald's in India, they don't sell burgers with cow meat because Hindus don't eat cows, right? So instead they have like a chicken tikka masala burger and stuff. That's syncretism. TikTok. TikTok is like the coolest example of syncretism for me. Like every time I'm on TikTok, I'm such a nerd and I'm just like, this whole thing is syncretism. It was like, what is it? A Chinese company. It's people from different generations all around the world mixing trends together, using music that was intended for one thing and is now used for something different. It's like, it's such a cool example of like what syncretism is combining different cultures together. Okay. We also have rapid economic growth and expansion, but that also leads to rapid inequality. So the overall economy is booming, and in certain states it's getting bigger, but the inequality is growing more vast. And that's partly then happening where different parts of the world are now having completely different problems, different ends of the spectrum. So whereas like more advanced states are experiencing problems associated with longevity and long life, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, then other countries on the same planet are still dealing with problems associated with poverty, malaria, lack of clean water, that sort of thing. If you only know one event from Unit 9, everyone listen up. If you only know one event from Unit 9, it shows up on the AP exam literally every year. You should know the Green Revolution. This is not like an environmentalist movement, although it kind of is, but the Green Revolution started really in Mexico and India, and it is like using new and advanced technology and science to make agriculture more productive. And so this is like GMOs. This is, for example, like growing like insect-resistant strains of crops, growing crops that produce more. This is, again, like literally Unit 9, we have just made it full circle back to Unit 1 and 2 again. This is champa rice, right? GMOs are just champa rice, and bananas reaching Africa and that sort of thing, right? So now we can predict the future. Where are the Mongols going to come from? I don't know. We also have like global capitalism, right? Because when the Cold War ends, capitalism won. And so we now have like, instead of the British East India Company, we have Nike, right? Like we have these corporations that are truly global and wield more power than most states do. Okay. Lastly, and not to end on a downer, but like the world is increasingly interconnected, and so our problems and solutions are going to have to go beyond the nation state. And here's the thing that's really interesting that I want to leave y'all with before I just answer as many questions as I can. The map of the world that you are used to seeing is weird and new. This map is so strange and so new. Think about most of world history. We've been dealing with like big empires and then kind of spaces in between of sort of nomadic or no man's land, right? We've had like, oh, Dar al-Islam and Christian Europe and whatever, like the Aztecs and the Inca, whatever. The fact that we, since World War II, are kind of trying to like let every person decide for themselves what they want their government to look like is insane. Not necessarily bad, but just it's insane. We are attempting to apply the Enlightenment to the entire globe. We established a UN Declaration of Human Rights for the world, right? Do we respect it and honor it all the time? No. We're trying to allow each state to figure out its own borders for itself. Obviously, different states get involved. But the point is that the irony is that right at the moment when we actually really need these massive units that could like act together because we have problems like climate change or, you know, decreasing drinkable water supply or global pandemics or whatever, right at that moment is also at the moment where we're like, let's just let everyone be super individualistic and all have their own nation state. And it's like, oh, such a bummer, right? Because think about like a problem like climate change. Right? And I'm all for democracy, but it's just ironic, right? Because think about a problem like climate change. Think about if you still had a thing like the British Empire that controlled, let's think about all the places the British controlled at one point. Oh my God, right? I mean, so many parts of this and parts of China and up here and most of Africa. Like, think about then how much easier it would be to do something about climate change if you could just convince England to do something. And then they're like, we decree. And now all of their colonies have to do the same thing. You'd only have to talk to like 5 people to like solve a problem like that. But now that we've insisted, and I think it's really cute of us to do this, but now that we've insisted on individualism and democracy and rights, No, we got to deal with 195 different countries, right? Which we're obviously seeing the issues with that. So on that adorable and sad note, I want to scroll through and see what questions y'all have. Okay, so Q&A. Ask me whatever you want for the last 5 to 10 minutes. I saw someone talking about like the most important units. I think units 4 through 8. 4 through 8 are by far the most important. I guess technically 3 through 8, but 3 is just such a weird unit. Within that, I also have a theory that I think that the even units are more important than the odd units. So like unit 1 sets up the states, and then unit 2 is like them interacting. Unit 3 sets up the empires. Unit 4 is them interacting, so on and so forth. So I also think like spending more time on the even units, because that's them like doing stuff to each other, which is a lot more helpful. A lot of questions about the SAQ. The short answer question, the key to that is just answer the question you're being asked, right? So really it's like there's a general format that most teachers use, which is like you should ace the question, which means answer, and I'm going to put this in one thing, and cite a specific piece of evidence. That's A and C. I think that can all be done in one sentence. And then explain how it connects to the prompt. Those are like the 3 things you need to do. That could be 2 sentences or 3 sentences. I think if you're writing more than 4 sentences on an SAQ, like A or B or C, you're writing too much. Now, the only difference is like if you get a prompt that just says identify, it just says like identify one example of a colonial state that negotiated for its independence. You'd be like, one example is Ghana, and then you'd move on. That's all you need to do. But if instead it's like identify and explain how one negotiated, you'd be like, one example, and I'm answering someone else's question here. Notice what I'm doing. One example was Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah was a powerful leader who believed in Pan-Africanism, and he used the support of other African people and nations to gain more legitimacy in negotiating with the British. So he basically is like one of the people that really starts these Pan-African movements. And so it's not just little Ghana that's going to negotiate. He's like, hey, I'm kind of speaking for a lot of African people. And so it's strength in numbers. You sort of need to listen to me because I have a lot of sway over these other people. And so if you work with me and we negotiate, great. They're all going to see that you're willing to negotiate too. But if not, you might get a lot of wars on your hand, right? Okay. Do not connect your life to an essay. You can use like if an LAQ asks you about like global problems and global solutions from 1900 to the present, you for sure can talk about COVID. But don't ever relate anything you're writing about to your own life. Like, it's amazing to me how many essays I read where they'll be like, and that's why, thanks to the Silk Road, I can use my iPhone to talk to my friends. And it's like, no one cares. I'm so sorry. Like, I love you, but like, no one cares. And so, yeah, if the time period it gives in the essay is like, let's say maybe it might be like 1914 to the present, then yeah, you can talk about stuff today. You can talk about K-pop as an example of cultural syncretism. You could talk about whatever. Just be mindful, right, that some prompts might be like 1914 to 2001 or to like 1991, which is like to the end of the Cold War. So again, I think that there are only a few years you should know. I would know 1200. I would know like around 1300 is like the kind of height of the Mongols. I just think that's helpful to know. Then I would know 1450, which really is 2 things. It's 1453 Ottomans conquer Constantinople. So it's like the gunpowder empires are in full force, and then 1492 is Columbus. So that's why that era starts when it does, is because you have gunpowder empires and you have the age of exploration. Then I would know 1750, which is really like the 1760s is the steam engine, and 1776 is the United States Enlightenment. So again, that's the era of industrialization, imperialism, and new nation states. Then I would know, I would just know like the 1850s to the 1880s are like chaos in Asian states. So that's going to be like Opium Wars. That's going to be Meiji Restoration in Japan. That's going to be Sepoy Rebellion. Like all these things, like Russia emancipates the serfs. That's going to be the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms. Like, it's basically like, if you're thinking about like these big Asian empires responding to modernization, it's all happening kind of in that second half of the 1800s. And then I would know 1914 starts World War I. I would know 1919 is the Paris Peace Conference. The war ends in 1918, but still. I would know 1929, Depression starts. 1939, World War II starts. 1941, USSR, Japan enter the war. And I would know 1945, World War II ends. And 1991, Cold War ends. Take a picture of this. These are like the years I for sure would know. And notice, you want to know more dates from the 20th century, because again, if you get a document, the difference between 1929 and 1919 is pretty enormous, right? So, okay, how should we study for the LEQ, and how should you study in general? A lot of people have been asking, like, what's the CED? The CED, if you just go Google, and I also have a copy on my website, Google AP World course and exam description. And you're going to get this huge PDF, just Control F to like 1.1. That tells you like, here's the learning objective for 1.1. Here's what you need to know. And it gives you the big ideas. If you don't want to do that, go to marcolearning.com and download their free AP World Study Guide. Those are like, each unit or era is like 1 or 2 pages of just the big picture, and it's way nicer to look at. So I would go to marcolearning.com and download those study guides too, because that will give you like the big idea. So then for the LEQ or for the SAQs, whatever they ask you about for those are gonna be on big developments. And then they just want to know, like, can you back it up with specific evidence? So you don't need to know everything, but you do, in theory, you need to know all of the major developments and then have 1 or 2 pieces of evidence to back each of those up, right? So let's say you got a, let's say you got an LEQ that was like, evaluate the success, or evaluate strategies of decolonization movements from 1945 to 2001, whatever, right? And if you're like, evaluate the strategies, well, what they're really asking is like, some states negotiated independence, was it successful? Some states fought for independence, was it successful? And so in that case, right, if you're evaluating the strategies, you literally could be like, one paragraph could be like, some states peacefully negotiated for independence and were relatively successful. For example, Ghana, for example, India, right? And obviously you'd want to explain that a little bit more. And be like, however, other states were forced to fight, and even though they were ultimately successful, it took a lot longer. For example, Vietnam. That's a great LEQ. Like 3 pieces of evidence, that's it. But again, the most important thing is now really explaining, like, why is Vietnam, why am I arguing that Vietnamese independence was less successful than Indian independence? Well, I'm arguing it took a lot longer, it cost a lot more lives, blah, 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 blah. So again, it's actually, for the most part, on all the writing, it's quality over quantity. Same with the SAQ. Once you get the point, I stop reading. There's no bonus points. So if they're asking you, like, identify and explain one strategy used in the Cold War to gain influence between the US and the Soviet Union, you'd be like, if one strategy was the space race, and then you're literally like, both states wanted to show that they were scientifically dominant, and so they raced to be the first to land a man on the moon. And the United States got there first. And that's it. You then don't have to keep going and be like, also nuclear weapons and blah, blah, blah. And also this thing. On the SAQ, it's about time. You don't have a ton of time for those questions. And so you want to just answer what the question is asking. And when in doubt, just add 1 more sentence, very clearly linking it back to the prompt. That's the biggest problem I see, is students like do pretty well at being like, here's my answer, here's my evidence. And it's like, when in doubt, reread the prompt, whether it's an SAQ, an LEQ, a DBQ, reread the prompt, and then write out 1 more sentence being like, and this connects back because, like, be very blunt about it, right? Okay, I'm going to scroll through and see if I can find a few more questions. Outside evidence cannot be from a different time period. That would be context. So let's say you got a DBQ and it was asking you about like evaluate the way the Cold War was fought. That's a terrible question, but you know what I mean. So if it's like evaluate ways in which the Cold War was fought, or evaluate the ways in which the United States attempted to gain influence throughout the 20th century. That's a better question. So if the prompt is like, evaluate the US trying to gain influence, and it's like the 20th century, all of your evidence from the documents, your own evidence, has to all be within those parameters. It has to be about the United States trying to gain influence in the 20th century, right? Anything else is context. So, for example, if there were a bunch of documents that showed, you know, like CIA and blah, 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 and then you wanted to bring up an additional piece of evidence and you wanted to talk about like McDonald's, you could be like, hey, also, you know, the United States, through their sort of capitalism, actively supported corporations to go out and establish franchises around the world. For example, McDonald's and Starbucks, you know, set up shop in tons of different countries. And this was sort of an informal way that the United States was able to gain cultural influence in other parts of the world. That's great. That's the US. It's in the 20th century. If you're going to talk about the US trying to gain influence through like the Monroe Doctrine, that's the 1800s. So it's context, and it's awesome context. But the point is, like, whatever prompt they give you, I always encourage you to like figure out whatever the keywords are. So let's say the prompt is like, evaluate the extent to which newly independent states wanted communism. That's such a bad prompt, but you know what I mean. Okay. So, and then it'd be like between, you know, 1945 and 1991. Okay. So if that's the prompt, then what I always suggest that my students do is I'm like, okay, well, identify the keywords there, right? So you're looking at, you have to talk about newly independent states, whether or not they want communism, and 1945 to 1991. So if this is an LEQ, all of your evidence, if we think of this like a triangle, all your evidence has to fit within this. It has to be about newly independent states wanting or not wanting communism in this time period, right? So you could talk about Kerala and the land reform. You could talk about Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. You could talk about whatever, right? But the only time in your essay, whether it's a DBQ or an LEQ, the only time that you can leave one of those or more, like you could talk about before 1945 or not newly independent states, is context. It's the only time. Otherwise, everything in your essay needs to be within all the rules of the prompt. So again, you could talk about like before 1945, if there were states you could think of. Or you could talk about not newly independent states, right? You could be like, there were some states that have been around for a really long time, like China, although they were sort of independent, right? But it's like you could talk about other things then and kind of zoom out. Or you could talk about the rise of communism and why it would then, like what Marx was talking about and what the Soviets did, and then why it would appeal to newly independent states, right? So you can zoom out from these different things. All right, last few questions. Scrolling through, I'm sorry, I'm missing so many of these. Will I do another live for units 3 to 6? I already did those. Go look at my channel. This is my last live that I'm doing with content. A lot of you are taking the test on Monday. I'm going to take next Wednesday off, and then I'll do another live 2 Wednesdays from now, which will be the night before the May 20th test. So I'm going to take next Wednesday off, but that doesn't mean I'm going to make some new videos and stuff. So if I don't answer your question in these next few minutes, go find my Instagram. I'll post a thing on my stories right after this where you can submit your questions to me there. Okay. Let's see. I'm not going to explain complexity, but I did a whole YouTube video on it. So if you go to my channel, I did a YouTube video for each of the points of the DBQ rubric for last year. So if you're confused about like what context is or what complexity is, go check that out. Let's see. Is the multiple choice in chronological order? Yes, it's in chronological order. And for the evidence points, generally in all the essays, there's 2 evidence points. And generally the first one is like, do you have evidence? That could be the documents. You're like, do you address 3 documents in some way? And then the second point is like, does it connect to an argument you're making? That's really the biggest distinction. So in an LEQ, you'll get a lot of people that will be like, the United States trying to gain influence. They had Starbucks around the world. They had people wearing blue jeans. They sent the CIA in, like, and they're just listing out evidence. And so the grader will be like, yeah, okay, you know some things. You had some evidence, but you don't get that. You only get that second evidence point if you clearly, like, connect it to a bigger argument. So honestly, if you're dividing your essay, whichever essay that is, into body paragraphs, and you have a clear topic sentence where you're like, in this paragraph, I'm arguing that the US used CIA operations to gain influence, then all your evidence clearly connects to that only. That's what the second point means. So it's basically like, do you have evidence, and then do you use it? Like, do you actually really explain it, or are you just listing a bunch of random stuff? If you don't know the specific answer to an SAQ, just guess. Yeah, like tell us what you do know. You should think of all the writing as a chance to just show us whatever you do know. There is no way, I was a grader last year, there's no way for us to take points away from you. So even if you say something wrong, it's okay. If you say something right, you can still get a point for that. So I graded essays last year that had like great context and a great thesis, and then their essay was total garbage. Like their essay made no sense. All their evidence was wrong, but I was like, hey, you still get a 2. I mean, I can't take away those points that you earned in the first paragraph. So when in doubt, like write it on the page. And even if it's an SAQ and you're like, shoot, I can't think of a specific example, the thing you know might be specific enough. Sometimes what you think we need for specific evidence is not that, right? So if we're asking for like identify and explain one example of a proxy war, right? And you're like, oh shoot, I don't actually know like which side the US supported and blah, blah, blah. It could be like, hey, one example of a proxy war was Angola. They had a civil war and the US and Soviet Union supported different sides. You might be nervous that you're like, I don't know which sides they supported and I don't know who won. Guess what? I don't either. I don't know. I can never remember. I don't even know which side won in Angola. I don't know if they're communists now. I have no idea. So again, even if you're a little worried that it's like an incomplete answer, just put what you do know on the page because you never know. But if you leave it blank, like we can't do anything for you, right? So you should guess on literally every single question. Okay. Are erasable pens allowed? I don't think so. I think that because the whole point of making you write the essays in pen, if you're taking the paper test on Monday, is so that they don't accidentally get erased when they're transporting them to be graded. So I think, no, I think it just needs to be a regular pen. Let's see. Okay. I am going to have to pause there. Ooh, like how many reasons or subclaims are needed to support the thesis? I would suggest 2. But like if you have 1, but it's really strong and you have a lot of evidence to support it, that can be okay too, right? Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to end the live here. Thank you for joining me. And really, those of you who've been joining like the last few weeks, this is awesome. I'm immediately going to go post on my stories a question thing where you can submit more questions, and I will just like periodically add more to my stories, and I'll also do some TikToks where I will try to address as many questions that you have between now and Monday. So if you're not already, then make sure that you're following me in these different places: anti-social studies on TikTok, anti-social studies on Instagram. And I will do my best to answer as many questions as I possibly can. And then in the meantime, if you're not already subscribed to Heimler's History, starting on Friday, so May 7th, May 8th, May 9th, we're going to be going live all together to help you do a last-minute cram session of the content. For those of you who are taking the test May 20th or later, I will see you for another live in 2 weeks. That will be the night before the May 20th exam. All right, bye y'all. This live will be immediately saved and record, like it's going to be up on my YouTube channel, so you can send it to friends or whatever and look at it later. Okay, awesome.